I'm Rob Stoner. I'm the Deputy Director of MIGHTY, and it's delightful to see everyone here. Thank you for battling the weather if you had to. Those 53% of us who pay attention to what's going on outside our borders in this country and take a positive view of them will be aware that Mexico has become a crucial trading partner of this country, and its economy has become increasingly intertwined with our own to our mutual benefit. Fewer of you will have a detailed understanding of the very significant changes that have been taking place in Mexico over the last several years with respect to the energy sector. They've been literally remaking the regulatory system, redesigning markets, and even changing their constitution to accommodate changes that will help us both accelerate our response to climate change and grow our economies. I'm delighted to be able to introduce someone today who was at the center of these changes, formulating them and beginning to put them into practice, and has just returned from a 4-year stint in the Mexican government at the highest level, Lourdes Melgar. Lourdes began in 2012 as the Undersecretary of Electricity in Mexico, and then after completing her assignment there, moved on in 2014 to being the Deputy Secretary for Energy, and in particular for hydrocarbons. She's now a researcher on the National Science and Technology Council of Mexico, and I'm happy to say she's with us this year at MIT as the Robert Willem Fellow at the Center for International Studies. The best thing of all is that Lourdes is an MIT alumni and earned her PhD in 1992 in political science. So please join me in welcoming Lourdes. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for being here today. And Rob, thank you very much for the introduction. Before I begin, I would like to thank the MIT Energy Initiative for inviting me to give this talk, and also to the Center of International Studies for appointing me as Wilhelm Fellow for this year. I'm going to take about 45 minutes to talk you through Mexico's energy reform. It's a really huge reform. It's an all-comprehensive energy reform, which Fatih Birol from the International Energy Agency has referred to as an energy revolution. And I guess you're going to get to see why that is. But first, I begin with this picture, which really is, I think it's one of the type of pictures that we might see someday in textbooks in Mexico, because this reform took a long time to happen. And what do I mean by this? Well, Mexico is one of the very last countries that opened up its energy sector to private investment. And this is sort of surprising if you think of the fact that all of the rest of the economy has been open since the 1990s, the late 1980s and 1990s. And this has to do with the fact that for Mexicans since 1938, energy, and in particular oil, was equated to national sovereignty. And so the idea of opening up the energy sector, especially the oil and gas sector, to private investment was seen as a major challenge. And there had been attempts at having energy reform either in the electricity sector or in the oil and gas sector, but we had not succeeded. And the thing is, this is not an ideological position, and this is an important point for me to make. The reason why Mexico needed an energy reform has to do with energy security. So let me take you rapidly through where we were before the reform. And this graph, what it shows is how over the years the levels of investment kept on rising in oil production, and yet the production kept on coming down, kept on declining. We reached our peak in 2004 with 3.4 million barrels a day, and about 2 million barrels came from Cantarell, which was a supergiant field, which reached its peak 2004. Nowadays, it's producing about 300,000 barrels a day. So you can see how it had a really sharp decline. And part of the problem with increasing investment and not getting the expected results has to do with the fact that Mexico had already developed the most easy fields, and it had to go into more challenging areas, such as deeper waters, not just deeper, but really deep and ultra-deep waters in the Gulf of Mexico, as well as trying to develop non-conventional resources. And Pemex, the oil and gas company, the national oil and gas company, really didn't have the technology, the know-how, but more importantly, all the resources, all the economic resources, financial, technological resources that you needed to develop these areas. So despite investment, like for instance, huge investment in the Chicontepec area, which is tight oil, the results were not there. In addition, we had a problem because we were increasing our consumption of natural gas. And even though the production of natural gas kept on increasing, our imports went from 2% of our consumption in 1997 to around 27% in 2012. And we couldn't import more because we had not enough pipelines, not enough importing capacity to be able to take advantage of the shale revolution in the US. Of course, having to use fuel oil for generating electricity at a time that the prices of oil were above $100 had an impact on our electricity rates. And these graphs were very important when we were trying to persuade Congress of passing an electricity reform, because what it shows is that despite significant levels of subsidies in residential areas and in agriculture, our electricity rates were 25% higher than in the United States. And here I like to point out a couple of rates that are particularly relevant. One is the industrial rate, which was 84% higher than in the United States, and the commercial rate, which was 134% higher, in addition to public service rates. So we had a problem because about 0.75% of GDP went to subsidies to the electricity sector. And despite this, and despite all the efforts, our rates were basically non-competitive, and this was having an impact on our competitiveness in our manufacturing sector. And just as an anecdote, I'll tell you that there were companies who were based in Tijuana or on the other side, or on the Mexican side of the border, that were being invited to move to Arizona or to Texas, where electricity and natural gas were widely available at cheaper prices. So during the 2012 presidential campaign, the three key leading parties of Mexico ran on a platform that included energy reform. Only the right-wing party, Acción Nacional, and the PRI, that is the party of the current President Peña Nieto, were proposing to have a constitutional reform. The left-wing party, PRD, thought that we could do with just a reform without changing the constitution, which is something that the Calderón administration did for the oil and gas sector, but we did not get the results that we were looking for, in part because Pemex was not allowed to get into associations with in partnerships with other companies. So the main commitment that the president made for energy reform was that it would help lower electricity rates. And in reality, the goals of the energy reform are much broader. Of course, there's energy security, and I already talked about how oil and gas have been declining. Oil and gas production had been declining. But there was also something very important. Mexico is one of the very few countries that has a climate change law. We have a very serious commitment to climate change mitigation, and we have established commitments to increase our production of electricity with clean energies. So that was another area that we wanted to be able to comply with. In addition to that, we needed to be able to invest in state-of-the-art technologies, both in the electricity sector and in oil and gas, as well as optimize all revenues, boost the economic growth, generate employment, and of course, increase Mexico's competitiveness. So how did we propose to do this? Well, what the energy reform does is that it creates a new model, completely new model, which, we didn't invent the wheel. We basically looked at what was happening in other parts of the world, and we took what was international best practices. But basically, we were moving from a model based on state-owned monopolies to open market competition. Now, we included key principles to this reform. One of them, and this is something that happens all over the world, perhaps with the exception of the United States, is that hydrocarbons belong to the nation. Hydrocarbons in the subsoil belong to the nation. And this was central, very important to Mexican society. The other one was very clear rule of the law with very clearly established role for each one of the institutions. Before the reform, there was a lot of mismatch, and for instance, Pemex was the state oil company, but it was also the regulator, and it was also doing policy. Now it's very clearly who does what, when, and how. Stronger institutions, of course, trying to create markets really requires that you have strong regulators that can be run and can work based on technical rulings and not on political rulings or any other type of concerns. Sustainability also is crucial, and it is imbued throughout the reform. And here, when we talked about sustainability, we're really talking about sustainability in its three components. That is economic sustainability, social sustainability, and environmental sustainability. And transparency. Transparency is something also that runs across the entire reform. It's not just lip service, it's really something that you can actually see happening right now. All the information regarding the reform, all the revenues that are obtained, you can get on internet and get them for free and see all the information on time. In addition to that, Mexico has presented its candidacy to become a compliant country of the EITI, the Initiative for Transparency in the Extractive Industries. Okay, so what is this reform about? Well, at the legal level, we changed 3 articles of the Constitution. And changing Article 27 of the Mexican Constitution, it's more or less trying to change the Second Amendment here in the United States. It's something very difficult, but it's something that we were able to do. So 3 articles doesn't sound like much, but the important thing is that in addition to the 3 articles of the Constitution, we included 21 transitory articles in the constitutional reform, which means the whole model has been fully defined and is at the constitutional level, which is something very important because sometimes people say, well, what will happen if another government comes? Will they be able to revert the reform? Well, in Mexico, it's very hard to change the constitution, so it will be very difficult to change the model because the model is established at the constitutional level. In addition to that, we enacted 10 new laws, amended 12 laws. There were 25 bylaws and regulations that were issued, and we created new institutions. Now, important thing about the new institutions is that these 2 new institutions, Senagas and Senace, are basically independent system operators, one that will run the natural gas market and the other one the electricity market. In addition to that, sort of following what is done here in the United States, where the Mineral Management Services was divided up into BESI and BOEM, we created the equivalent of BESI, which is ASEA, which is the National Agency for Industrial Safety and Environmental Protection of the Hydrocarbon Sector. And we have as its counterpart the Comisión Nacional de Hidrocarburos, the National Hydrocarbons Commission, which is the upstream regulator and is also in charge of doing the bids for the upstream. Now, we also created the Mexican Petroleum Fund, which is a fund based within the Central Bank of Mexico, which is an autonomous body. And it's basically following sort of like the Norwegian model to have sort of an autonomous body that manages the oil and gas resources. And I'm going to talk about this later on a little bit more. But this is very important because it really changes the way in which we use the oil revenues. Well, in terms of the regulators, not only did we strengthen them, but we also gave them very clear rules of the game about how they can interact with permissioners. And regulators can never sit on a one-to-one basis with a permissioner. They have to have at least 2 regulators, and the sessions are taped and the minutes are made public. A lot of transparency here. If you are interested, you can follow the meetings of the board of the commissioners online as they happen. So upstream regulator, downstream regulator, and also electricity regulator is the Comisión Reguladora de Energía. And then we transformed Pemex and CFE from being state government entities to become state productive enterprises. And here, basically what this means is that they are run as if they were public in the sense of being listed companies in the stock exchange. Although they are not listed in the stock exchange, they have a board of directors that include independent board members, and basically they have to become productive. That is, they have to generate income in order to grow. So let me take a few minutes to talk first about the upstream, and then I will talk about the creation of the different markets. In the upstream, what we did is that because this is such a sensitive issue for Mexican society, in addition to maintaining hydrocarbons in the subsoil that belong to the nation, we did something else, which is that it is the state can hire through different means, either a state productive enterprise or private participants, to do exploration and production activities. So what this means is that in terms of the state productive enterprise, and basically means Pemex, we can grant them entitlements. And there was a constitutional transitory article that established how to grant Pemex its entitlements. We did what is called Round Zero. This is something that Brazil and Colombia also did when they opened up their energy sector. And basically, Pemex had to show that the areas that they were wanting to keep, that they could develop them because they had the technical, financial, and managerial capabilities to develop them in an efficient manner. Pemex presented its request, and the Senate had about 3 months to go over the proposal and make a decision. We did this work in the spring of 2014, and this is important because at the time the oil prices were above $100. So the numbers I'm going to give you are based on $100 a barrel, which is Pemex got 83% of Mexico's 2P reserves, 21% of Mexico's prospective resources. It got a balanced portfolio because, as you can see, they got areas in shallow waters, in deep waters. They got onshore areas, and they got also some tight oil resources and some shale resources. But this portfolio at the time would allow Pemex to continue production in the order of 2.5 million barrels a day over the next 20 years and a half. So as you can see, it still puts Pemex in a very good position compared to other companies in the world. Now, after Round Zero, Pemex, if they want to increase their acreage, they have to compete as any other company and participate in the bids of the states. So that's the other way in which the state can do EMP activity is through contracts that are presented in bids, that are also international bids, fully transparent. You can follow them through internet. You can download the terms and conditions and the model contract from the webpage of it's called Rondas de Mexico. And here the Constitution established that we do not have concessions in Mexico. Concessions are banned. But we have different type of contracts. We have license contracts, production sharing contracts, profit sharing contracts, and service contracts. License contracts and production sharing contracts are the type of contracts that are mostly used in other parts of the world. The big challenge for us as we designed these contracts, and this was the first time that we were doing this since the last private contracts that Mexico had been signed at the beginning of the 20th century. The big challenge was to make sure that our license contracts were license contracts and were not concessions, because otherwise they would not stand constitutional challenge. So with that in mind, this was round one as we presented it in August 2014. The day we presented this, WTI was $102 a barrel. Now, as you know, we started from there a rapid decline of oil prices, which of course had an impact in the type of assets that we ended up leasing, and also in terms of the timing and the time frame in which we did the bids. Originally, we were meant to finish round one by the summer of 2015. Actually, round one finished on December of last year, December 2016. So let me just show you rapidly what happened. The first bid, which was announced in December of 2014, was exploration in shallow waters, and we awarded only 2 contracts out of 14. Some people said this was an absolute failure. For me, it was not a failure, because we managed to put a very high bar in terms of bidding contracts in a competitive way and a transparent way. The 2 contracts that were awarded had a lot of competition, especially this one, number 7. And we changed history, because we already had 2 new players participating in the oil and gas industry in Mexico. After that, we had in September, we had the second bid of that year, September 2015. And here I have to say I was very happy, because this contract here was won by Eni, the Italian company Eni. So our view was, if Eni is willing to sign a contract such as ours, it means it's a good contract. And in addition to Eni, we had a company here that was a joint venture between BP and an Argentinian company, and also Spanish funding. And then we had an independent operator from the U.S., Fieldwood, in association with a new Mexican company. Then we had this bid, and this bid is the third bid. It's onshore, mature fields, very tiny fields. This was important for political reasons, because there was a lot of concern that we could not just have a reform where we have foreigners come in. We really wanted to generate a new ecosystem of companies that will be participating in the energy sector in Mexico. And we needed to make sure that we had opportunities for the contractors of Pemex and for other new companies to begin learning the process of becoming an operator, and eventually being able to graduate from this type of project to a more important project, to eventually, going to shallow waters and to deep waters. The surprising thing here was that we had this bid December 15th, 2015, which was really getting at the lowest level of oil prices. The lowest level was actually in January. And we were able to award the 25 contracts. So 25 contracts out of 25 were awarded, mostly to Mexican companies, but we also had a Canadian company, Renaissance, and we had a couple of US operators and a company from the Netherlands that participated and won contracts in this bid. Now, the big date actually was December 5th of last year, because the key test for the success of the opening in the upstream was whether or not the big companies would be coming to work in Mexico. And here, I would say to my surprise, because I didn't expect such great success, 8 contracts out of 10 contracts were awarded. And what is interesting is who the players are that actually won the contracts. One of them is the Chinese company, the Chinese National Oil Company, which won this block, so you will have them very close to the US border, and this block. Then you have a consortium formed by Total as the operator and ExxonMobil, another one by Statoil, BP, and Total, where Statoil is the operator, and they won one contract here and another contract down here. Petronas from Malaysia in association with Sierra Oil and Gas, which is a newly created Mexican oil company that has won contracts in the first and the second bid and now in the deep waters. And, I forgot, Chevron in association with Pemex. Chevron, of course, as the operator. And then Murphy from the US with Ophir, Petronas, and Sierra Oil and Gas. So what we're beginning to see is really a completely change in the landscape of the type of companies that are operating in Mexico's upstream sector. We decided not to conduct bids on shale resources because the oil prices were very low, but also because we felt that we didn't have the adequate regulation that we need to make sure that this activity is done in a sustainable manner. I have to say that there are a lot of companies, especially from Texas, that are interested in developing shale resources in Mexico. But there are some challenges. The conditions are really different from what you have in the United States. One of the reasons being that you have to deal with the ownership of the land. And in many cases, the ownership of the land is not just private property, but you also have ejido land and communal land. There are water issues, and there are other type of social issues that need to be worked in order to get the social licensing for that. But that's something that is also in the makings. So the other interesting part of the story is that Pemex, the reform allows Pemex now to do joint ventures, but they're not allowed to just sit down and do it on a one-to-one negotiation. We decided, and this was something that Congress decided, that it needed to be done also through a bidding contest, which was actually a major challenge because this is not the way companies usually do the farm out of their acreage. But we conducted the first farm out in December of last year, and it was actually a very exciting, very competitive process for Trion, which is a discovery that Pemex did in the ultra-deep waters of the Gulf of Mexico. And not only was this the first farm out, but it was the first time that we had a tie in the bid. And we had to go through a bonus to decide who was going to be the winner. And it was BHP Billiton from Australia that won this contract. Now, we decided to keep some planning in our reform, and there are 3 areas in which we have planning. One of them is in the upstream, and we think it's very important to have a 5-year plan where companies can look at it and know where we're heading in the future, what kind of acreage is going to be put for bid in the upcoming years. So an element that is included in the 5-year plan is that you can have nominations. So companies can nominate areas, and every spring they can go and sign confidentiality agreements with CENER, propose areas that will be evaluated, and then CENER will decide whether or not they're put up in the bid. And CENER will be making adjustments to the 5-year plan on a yearly basis, depending on different sorts of conditions, not only what is of interest to the companies, but also issues such as oil prices or requirements of the country, or also feedback that we get from the local states. So round 2 has already begun. It was announced in July. I was still the Deputy Secretary of Energy for Hydrocarbons when we announced the first bid of round 2. And these other two bids have already been announced, and the bidding dates will start in the spring. Now, one important element that we changed in the reform is that before the reform, Pemex sort of was the owner of all the information. And now all the information, CNH, the upstream regulator, is in charge of the information, and they issue permits for doing seismic work. A lot of seismic work has been conducted in the Gulf of Mexico. Over $2 billion have been invested in a very short period of time, and actually throughout a year, the whole Gulf of Mexico has been covered with seismic work. This is important because the companies are getting a lot of information about what kind of geology we have down there. It's good for the companies because they can nominate the areas, but it's also very good for the government because we have a better understanding of what kind of resources we have and how to price these resources. So finally, about the upstream, let me take a moment to talk about the new way in which we're managing oil revenues. Before, basically, Pemex produced the oil, sold the oil, and basically had to give all its revenue to the finance ministry. And the finance ministry got to decide how much Pemex would keep. Now, all the payments from the oil and gas activity goes to the Mexican Petroleum Fund, with the exception of taxes, the taxes which go directly to our IRS. Then there is a very clear ruling as to how this income is used. The Constitution established that up to 4.7% of GDP goes to funding the federal budget. And after that, the next 3% goes to long-term savings. And this is really key because this has to do with this sustainability view of things. It's this idea of making sure that future generations can also benefit from the wealth that Mexico has in terms of its oil and gas resources. So these long-term savings cannot be touched, just for whatever reason. There are very clear rules as to how and when it can be decided that this money be tapped. Otherwise, once we reach this 3% of GDP in long-term savings, then we have other funds that get funded. We have a universal pension fund, research and development, one specific for oil and gas projects and infrastructure, and another one for scholarships, connectivity, and regional development. So, of course, now that oil prices went down and they're recovering, it would take some time to get to this 3% and then to see income in these different funds. But eventually the idea is that we don't go again through an oil boom and don't know where the money went, as it happened with the oil boom that we had from 2008 to 2013. Now, so that was the upstream. Now, in terms of the rest of the energy sector, basically the idea is to create competitive energy markets. And here, what you will see, with the exception of transmission and distribution in the electricity sector, is that basically people get a permit and they do the activity. And this is why it's so important to have strong regulators. And this is also why our Antitrust Commission has a very important role playing, COFECE has a very important role playing in ensuring that we create competitive markets. So we are creating competitive markets in electricity, in natural gas, in LPG, and in gasoline. Let me go very quickly because I don't know how I'm doing in terms of time. Yeah? Okay. Okay. So I did mention that we had an issue with shortages of natural gas at the beginning of the administration. We had critical alerts, and this meant that we had to use fuel oil for electricity generation, but also that industry had to reduce the consumption of natural gas. So one of the things that we decided to do was to expand our infrastructure to be able to take advantage of the shale boom here in the United States. So this is the way our natural gas infrastructure system looked at the beginning of the administration. And this is how it has been growing over the years, so that by the end of the administration, the idea is that we would have increased almost double the amount of pipeline kilometers that we have in Mexico. We would have 10 new strategic pipelines, and we divided the concept of pipelines. Okay, here again, some planning. We have planning in the natural gas sector, where we created 3 types of pipelines. We have strategic pipelines, and these are pipelines that the Ministry of Energy decides that are fundamental, that we need them. They're sort of like the spine of the system. And those pipelines are bid through bidding contest, and they are developed by private investors. Basically, through the bidding contest, the rate is established, and they get a long-term contract from, most often from CFE, the national utility. Then we have merchant pipelines, and anybody who's interested in developing a pipeline can basically go to the Energy Regulatory Commission, get a permit, and develop the pipeline at their own costs and risks. And of course, CRE determines the tariff. And then we have what we call social coverage pipelines, and these are pipelines that they're not, that they don't make economic sense from a commercial point of view, but that we view it as essential in terms of bringing development to some parts of the country. So we have 2 social pipelines right now. We have one that would be developed from Lázaro Cárdenas to Acapulco, and another one from Salina Cruz to Tapachula, which will be the entrance to bring natural gas to Central America. These are pipelines that are basically financed through the federal budget, or through some way, some means that the finance ministry determines. Mexico will have, by the end of the administration, the capacity to import in the order of 9 BCFs from the United States, which is much more than what we actually consume. But we are investing in the order of $16 billion in pipeline development, with a lot of new interconnections to the United States. And this is very important because what we are seeing here is this incredible energy integration between the 2 countries. And of course, all of this planning and all of this view was developed before there were questions about, about NAFTA and about the benefits of this type of integration. We think it's very good for both countries, and also for the region in general, to be able to boost the consumption of natural gas in terms of decreasing emissions, but also in terms of increasing competitiveness. The other area, from here, so we have this, and from here we are moving to the creation of a competitive natural gas market. And here the role of Senagas, the independent system operator, becomes key. Senagas got the pipelines that belong to Pemex, so that Pemex is no longer a player throughout the whole chain in the natural gas market. They cannot transport. They can produce. They can be commercializers, but they cannot transport natural gas. Now, the other big story that is happening right now, and you've probably read in the news that Mexicans are very unhappy about the increase of fuel prices, but it has to do with the opening of the gasoline market. Just to give you an idea, before I go there, just to give you an idea, Mexico imports in the order of 53% of the gasoline it consumes. We have 6 refineries, but they're not very efficient, and we have not been very good at modernizing them and making them be up to par. In addition to that, our refineries were designed for processing light crude, and we produce mostly heavy crude. So our crude is sold to the U.S., and we are now in the process of importing some lighter crude for mixing it up and being more efficient. In any event, in terms of gasolines, let me just say that it was decided that the opening would be through stages. It would not be like the rest of the reform where it was immediate, but it would be through stages. And originally, there was a schedule that was agreed in the law where we would get to the final opening by 2018. Now, it was decided to move it up because we needed to make sure that investors got the right signal as to where we were going, and that they would be able to do the investments that are needed to make sure that we can actually lower the prices of gasoline through a competitive process. Now, a couple of things that are important. The subsidies for gasoline in 2012 were equivalent to 3% of GDP, which is huge. And so there was really sort of a view that we could not maintain the subsidy of gasoline because we were really benefiting the wealthiest of Mexicans. The first 2 deciles of the population were consuming over 50% of the gasoline. So I mean of the gasoline, therefore of the benefits of the subsidy. The other thing is the government never promised to lower gasoline prices. And this is something that the opposition uses a lot against the government, but I think it's important to point it out because indeed what the government did is that they put a carbon tax on gasoline. I did mention that Mexico has a climate change law and that we're committed to reducing emissions, and one of the areas where we have been working on that is in gasoline. So where are we there in terms of gasoline and diesel? First thing is we open up competition by brands at the beginning of last year. So we have new brands in Mexico, not just Pemex. We opened up imports in April of last year, but really the key was being able to liberalize the price so that companies could make decisions as to where to invest. And I just take one moment showing you this map. This is how Pemex used to bring, for instance, gasoline from Salina Cruz down up to Baja California, to Tijuana. Because, of course, this is where they had a refinery and they don't have one here. So now what you can imagine is that whomever is interested in bringing gasoline, for instance, from California, well, basically they can bring it by wheel, or you can bring it by rail, or they can build pipelines and in that way develop the infrastructure that we need. We also need a lot of development of infrastructure in storage and in maritime terminals. So what was proposed by the government was to liberalize the prices through stages, and right now we are here, starting with this part of the country, where indeed you can imagine that through the border is where it's easier because you can get low-price gasoline from the U.S. flowing, and the same way that originally it could be thought that you could import it, but through the ports. But this is how it is planned to be done throughout the year. It will be very interesting to see what happens because the opposition has grown increasingly against this liberalization of the fuel markets. The same way that LPG, 80% of Mexican households consume LPG, and we also liberalized the prices of LPG this year. They are determined by market prices. Here there is a little bit more of competition because we already had Mexican distributors, but now we could have international distributors as well. And it will be interesting to see how this moves, what happens over time. Now, very briefly, because I don't have much time, let me talk about the power sector. And the story of the power sector is actually really interesting because originally the reform did not contemplate an opening in the power sector. The government thought that basically by switching fuels it would be enough to lower electricity rates. But the challenges were enormous because we had been creating a parallel market where CFE basically controlled most of the market, and there were special schemes that were benefiting only certain participants. So it was decided to create a wholesale power market with an independent system operator and to give a lot of emphasis to boosting clean energies. So Now we have, in generation, it's completely open with the exception of nuclear energy. Nuclear energy can only be generated by the state, that is by CFE. But all the participants, including CFE, which has to divide up into different subsidiaries, they participate in the spot market and they sell through the long-term and the spot market. Through a long-term market and spot market, they sell to retailers that can be either private retailers or CFE, which then they can sell to qualified users or to basic service users. The basic service users are basically the ones that are getting the subsidies from for low consumption electricity. Now, transmission and distribution stay in the hands of the state, but the Constitution allows for a lot of flexibility in terms of the contracts and the type of contracting that CFE can do to benefit from private participation. And what do we mean by that? Well, there are some schemes, for instance, for reducing non-technical losses, that is the theft of electricity in distribution, where you can hire a company to do that and you pay them back by the results that they are getting. The other thing is that Mexico has commitments in terms of generating with clean energies with 35% by 2024, 40% by 2035, and 50% by 2050. And we have really huge potential, but we were not really realizing it. Now, the reform establishes clean energy certificates, and we have had auctions, and I'm going to show you the results of that here. Okay. Here are the auctions, and what we see is that the auctions have been extremely successful. First of all, we have a lot of participation from companies from different parts of the world with commitment investments in the order of $6.6 billion. But more interesting is that in a very short period of time, we're going to see a doubling of the amount of generation. This is just for solar and for wind. And in addition to that, one thing that people are noticing is that the prices we are getting are extremely low by international standards. Especially in solar, we are getting really low, very competitive prices. So we are going to be increasing very rapidly the amount of clean energy, solar, wind, but also geothermal. We have a specific geothermal law. Mexico has huge potential in geothermal. CFE was not really quite interested in developing them. CFE got to select the areas it wanted to keep, and the other areas are being given to through private participants, through permits, through concessions. So in this way, we are increasing also the geothermal generation. Just to finish with the electricity market, in addition to what I already mentioned, the clean energy certificates, we have the energy and the ancillary services, daily and hourly market, the capacity market, and the financial transmission rights. And we have had a lot of participation in those markets as well. In addition to that, we are increasing the transmission lines, which is really central to being able to boost the development of our clean energies in Mexico. Now, because we're running out of time and I really want to leave some time for questions, let me just finish by mentioning a couple of things. First of all is that it is expected that the reform will require for its implementation in the order of 135,000 new people coming and working in this sector. And by that, we don't mean just, oil and gas engineers or electricity engineers. We need all sorts of people. We need from, engineers to lawyers to anthropologists to people who can do negotiations with the people who are owners of the land or who have rights to the land. And so we have a very aggressive program for developing human resources. Mexico is investing it's giving 60,000 scholarships by 2018. And this not only for graduate degrees as it used to be the case, but also undergraduates and more importantly also for technical for people who want to develop technical skills. And Also, we have a lot of partnerships being developed with universities around the world. Some of the partnerships mean that we send students to study or abroad, but in some cases it also means that the universities are coming and training our professors so that our professors are very qualified to train the new generations of Mexican people. And in addition to that, given the importance that we give to the clean energy sector, we have created 5 new centers for innovation in the energy sector, one for solar, one for wind, one for geothermal, for biofuels, and for ocean energy. And will be investing also in a smart grid and in a carbon capture and storage center, where we have $100 million are being invested, and we have a commitment through Mission Innovation to double our investment in R&D. So this is where we are, and this is sort of like trying to wrap up very fast a lot of things that are going on in Mexico. If you think about it, the energy constitutional reform was approved in December 2013. We are in February 2017. A lot of things have happened, and I didn't talk about some of these issues that are going on in the social area, for instance. But let me talk a little bit about the challenges. I would start by the last one, which I think actually is the first one. One of the things that Mexico needs is to widen the support for the energy reform inside Mexico. People don't know the reform, people don't understand the reform, and people are overcritical of the reform. I can understand why, because the way that the government tried to convince people of the good things of the reform was at a political level, with political messages that sometimes don't make sense from a technical point of view. Like, for instance, saying that by the end of the administration we would be producing 3 million barrels a day, which is impossible. Technically, it's impossible. So people are skeptical about the reform, and I think it is very important to be able to explain to people why this model makes sense and why going back to the past is something that would be really bad for the country. But it also means that we need to make sure that the benefits of the reform trickle down. And this takes some time, but the reform has in it elements to make sure that we develop the value chain, that we generate employment in the energy sector. Mexico has everything it needs to become a manufacturer and supplier of the energy sector, not only in Mexico, but worldwide. As we do it in the automobile industry or the aeronautical industry, we could do it in the energy sector. In addition to that, we need to make sure that the social licensing part of the reform, which it has a full social chapter, both the hydrocarbons and the electricity law have a full social chapter where we also established the obligation to respect the rights of indigenous communities and having consultations and having negotiations. Well, all that part, the government really needs to work, not only CENER, because sometimes, people look and say, well, the Ministry of Energy has to do this. Well, it's not just the Ministry of Energy. You need to really get involved all the different areas of the government to make sure that the negotiations do take place, that people know their rights and their, what kind of benefits they can get, and that therefore you can generate a positive attitude towards the reform and at the same time generate that economic development that is expected. Fundamental to strengthen Pemex and CFE, I think Mexican society will be very unhappy with this reform if they don't see that these two companies, which are sort of very important to the national identity, are not strengthened. And also, being successful in implementing a security of supply policy is essential. When you're creating markets, when you're moving away from monopolies, and where you're moving away from the monopoly having the obligation of supplying the market, you need to have something to replace it. The problem is that that technical need doesn't go along with the political view of basically lowering prices, because somebody has to pay for that supply. So finding the right way to design this process is very important. And so finally, I would say, yes, we need to increase oil and gas production. I think that will happen over time. It's going to take some time because no energy project, no exploration and production, you don't get the results overnight. It takes time. But the important thing is to maintain the pace, to be very strategic in terms of the selection of the areas that are bid, and also to be very clean in terms of the creation of the markets, because if political pressure mounts and there is a sort of like a desire to try to change things and not maintain a technical approach, then the results would not be as good as they should be. Well, I would leave it at here, and thank you very much for listening, and I'm open to your questions.
Thank you. So we are open for business at the mics. If you'd like to ask any questions, please come on down and line up. And while you're doing that, I'll ask the first question. It's a simple one. What if somebody builds a wall? Maybe not a literal wall, but a tariff wall, and begins to sort of interfere with the free flow of power and imported gasoline across that border, and a tariff war ensues, and that market to the north gets more complicated.
I think your question is actually a very, very good question, because I talked a little bit about the integration that we have with natural gas. I didn't talk about the growing integration in the electricity sector as well. For instance, there are really interesting projects happening in the border with California, where you have dedicated green lines where wind energy is sold to San Diego, to help them meet their clean energy portfolio. So I think, in a very simple answer, I think everybody will lose. Mexico would lose, but also on the U.S. side, you will lose. Why? Let me take the case of natural gas. In the case of natural gas, as we speak, Mexico has already these long-term contracts, and so there is somebody who is consuming this natural gas. If it was decided for some reason that you would not be selling natural gas to Mexico, well, it would take some time to build the terminals that will allow you to export liquefied natural gas to other parts of the world. And during those 2 or 3 years that it could take to build these terminals, you would have a serious oversupply of natural gas in the United States. So that would bring the prices really down, and then you would not have the incentives to maintain production, and So right now, I think it's in the benefit of everybody to maintain that. From a Mexican perspective and from an energy security perspective, I think what is happening right now, it's a very good call to increase our energy security by ensuring that we produce our natural gas. I mean, we were sort of laying back and saying, we can consume, cheap natural gas from the U.S. The second question that you asked has to do with the fuels. And of course, it could be disastrous if we didn't get the gasoline that we need right now. But there are other options, because it's a market. Natural gas is very specific because it's still a regional market. In terms of the fuels, we could import from other parts of the world. Probably it would be more expensive, and we would have that kind of challenge. But yeah.
You might actually see investment in refineries.
Well, yes, exactly. We could actually see investment in refineries. Actually, it's interesting because we had, when I was at CENER, we had a couple of companies that approached us interested in developing refineries in Mexico. One of them wanted to export 100% of the production, which I thought was a really bad idea, because we don't want to have the environmental liability of having a refinery and zero of the benefit. But there were other ones that are based in Texas that are modular refineries that were actually looking at sites in Mexico and were interested and were seeing it as a business opportunity. And I think this is the big thing about Mexico's energy reform. It is also a big business opportunity because you have also very clear rules of the game and you have strong regulators, and as long as it's implemented from a technical perspective, you have everything to win.
Any questions? Can you speak it out? Or you can try to shout it out.
Sorry. So we seeing. Sorry, that's not very practical. We're seeing López Obrador and the elections, presidential elections, arriving around the corner next year. He's very against liberalization of CFE and Pemex. At the time when we started, the whole reform started. But how do you see all those measures strong? How strong are they in terms of legal change in the constitution? How, if the left was to pass on those elections, how damaging would be to those reforms?
Thank you thank you for your question. This is a question that I've gotten a lot when I was a public official. People, companies often ask me this question, and I have two answers. The first one is, as I mentioned, the model was inscribed at the constitutional level, so it's very difficult to change it. If they want to change it, they would need to have 2/3 of majority in Congress, both in the lower chamber and the upper chamber, and then they would need to have at least 18 states that have a similar balance and that they would approve a constitutional reform. So that's kind of difficult. The second one is sort of a practical one. I think whomever wins the election, whether they are from the far right or the far left or in the middle in Mexico, when they come and they see what the challenges are in the energy sector, what they would want is to make sure that they have readily available energy at competitive prices, and that they have the income that they need from the oil and gas production. So I think they're going to be quite pragmatic, because when you do look, see, this is my big issue. You have to look at the numbers. You have to look at the facts. The facts are Mexico will be producing just barely or probably below 2 million barrels a day this year, which numbers that we haven't seen since the 1980s. So, this shows you that, we have a true decline in oil production, which of course implies we are receiving less income, less revenue from oil. We need to increase our natural gas production. We have a lot of combined cycles. We have put everything into moving to this transition to natural gas, but we have a huge dependency with the US, so we need to do something to increase our production, because also it has an impact in terms of petrochemical production, and we have commitments that need to be respected. So I think that whomever comes, if they say, well, I'm going to revert this reform, how are they going to do to produce gasolines? It's not because the government doesn't want Pemex to produce gasolines. It's just, the refineries have not been efficient. The problem that we're facing right now is not a problem of this administration. It's a problem that comes from at least 15 years ago. So I think that they would have a much more pragmatic approach. That's my take on it.
Other questions?
I'll speak loudly. How do you see the tensions playing out between the government needing to raise prices on gasoline and the kind of beginnings of unrest that have happened now throughout the rest of the year, as they need to liberalize the prices even more in kind of the major demand centers?
See, I think the important thing in terms of gasoline prices is that it's very difficult when you tell people, well, like it happened in January. The increase for premium, which is the highest quality gasoline, which by the way is the one that is the least consumed, was 20%. But still, even for Magna, it was a significant increase. But the thing is, once you open up the market, what you will see are fluctuations in prices, and there are going to be moments in the year where the price goes up, and then there are going to be times when the price goes down. We saw this happening when we liberalized the price of tortillas, and people were extremely unhappy at first, but eventually they got used to it. I think the gasoline is really sort of showing or getting a lot of people who are mad with the government for a lot of different reasons, not just due to the price of gasoline. I think people are also unhappy because inflation has gone up, but I think what we will see is that prices will stabilize, and the outlook looks much better for the rest of the year in terms of this volatility. One thing that it's very difficult for the government, and I think in this case the government cannot do much, is that also the reason why prices have gone up has to do with the fact that we've been taken with a lot of volatility since the election of President Trump, and it has had a severe impact on our exchange rate, which of course, since we are importing gasoline and we're importing natural gas and all that, it has an impact on that. So I think the president has been very brave in saying that he will maintain his position, because the easy way out is to say, well, let's lower the price of gasoline. The reality is that in fiscal terms, Mexico basically is in a difficult situation in terms of maintaining its macroeconomic stability and, decreasing gasoline prices. So.
You mentioned about retail electricity sales and unregulated market briefly in one of your slides. Where do you see distributed generation and small-scale solar installations fitting in the picture? Because a lot of the energy auctions have been utility-scale systems at really low PPA prices, say 3 to 4 cents. Whereas if you're on the retail side looking at distributed generation, probably your PPAs aren't going to be at that high, but it may still serve to meet the electricity supply and lower the prices, retail prices.
There actually is a program to support distributed generation, and I don't have the technical details to answer your question, but what I know is that efforts have been put, this is one of the areas where efforts are being put to not only to boost clean energies, but also to help lower electricity rates. There are certain areas of the country, like for instance the northern part, like Hermosillo, where temperatures go really high in the summer, where having distributed generation is seen as one of the tools to make sure that we can lower electricity rates. So there is a whole program towards making it competitive. Yes.
One more before we break for cookies.
Thank you. You mentioned the social gas pipelines, the ones that were purple in the map. Why take natural gas to these places? Isn't what's necessary like further electricity to help development, or why natural gas?
That's a very good question. Well, first, in terms of electricity, what I would say is Mexico has a 98% coverage, which sounds good, but it means 2 million people, over 2 million people don't have access to electricity. The problem in Mexico is that the people that don't have access to electricity are people who live in remote areas. And so, bringing electricity to those areas, you bring it more through like solar panels or, basically through solar panels. The idea here, and it's isolated areas and scattered population. The idea here is more to bring natural gas to areas where we have not been successful to create development or generate employment. And so the idea is that with natural gas you'll be able to have industrial plants or some other type of industry that requires natural gas, and that way you would be generating other type of employment. I think in the case of Guerrero, that pipeline may actually change in terms of its design, because because if you really want to bring development, and if you really want to do it, perhaps it's better to do it from Morelos down to Acapulco. In the case of Acapulco, you do need electricity, and there have been attempts to build La Parota, which is a hydropower plant, for many years, and people are really opposed to it. So you need to sort of find a way to compensate. So a power plant might make sense there. In the case of Oaxaca and Chiapas, as I said, it's not only for Oaxaca and Chiapas, it's also bringing natural gas to Central America, and that's part of a whole strategy, foreign policy strategy as well, to bring stability and generate employment in that region.
It's going to be an interesting story to watch for the next 5 years. Thank you, Lourdes, for coming in, for explaining this.